In the bitter winter of 1934, the streets of Frankfurt were blanketed not just in snow, but in swastika banners. Among the marching boots and Nazi salutes, German women received a strange honor from their government. A bronze cross called the Cross of the German Mother, awarded in 3 classes: bronze for bearing 4 children, silver for 6, and gold for 8 or more. This wasn't just a medal. It was a weapon in disguise, a tool in the Reich's grand design to turn womanhood into a machine for racial engineering. One recipient, Elisabeth Kruger, a humble farmer's wife and mother of 9 from Bavaria, remembered the ceremony vividly. Her diary told a story the photographs didn't. She stood in front of hundreds, shoulder to shoulder with 16 other women, as the mayor praised them as guardians of German purity. But later that night, she wrote with trembling hands, "They praise my womb, but cage my thoughts." After the freedom German women had tasted during the Weimar Republic, voting rights, access to universities, careers, the Nazi vision was a brutal step backward. Under Hitler, a woman's value was reduced to 3 words: Kinder, Küche, Kirche, children, kitchen, church. This wasn't a new idea. It dated back to Emperor Wilhelm II, but Hitler's regime resurrected it with terrifying intensity. Women were fired from government jobs. Female university admissions were capped at 10%. Girls' schools replaced science and history with cooking and child-rearing classes. When one of Germany's brightest minds, mathematician Dr. Clara Neumann, was fired from Heidelberg University, in 1936 the explanation was chillingly blunt. A woman belongs by the hearth, not the lectern. But this new vision of womanhood wasn't just enforced with rules, it was sold with spectacle. To mold this new ideal, the Nazis launched a propaganda campaign unlike anything the world had seen. It was relentless, seductive, and everywhere. At the center of this machinery stood Helga Merz, leader of the Reich Women's Federation and a mother of 11 children from 2 marriages. She was hailed as the embodiment of the perfect Aryan woman, blonde, modest, strong, and obedient. She traveled across the country delivering fiery speeches, telling German girls, "Your mission is to serve life itself, from the cradle to the grave." Ironically, the woman preaching domesticity spent more time in trains and rallies than at home with her own children. The visual language of the regime was carefully crafted. Posters appeared on every wall, mothers cradling golden-haired babies, families beaming beside Hitler in lush pastures, Aryan children surrounded by flowers and flags. In a famous 1935 print titled "Defend Your Blood," a woman was shown standing like a goddess, arms outstretched to protect her children, as if she alone could shield the future of the German race. Propaganda didn't stop at posters. Women's magazines were gutted and rebuilt. Fashion and literature were replaced with articles about child-rearing, cooking, and racial hygiene. The most popular publication, the Homeland Voice, ran a monthly feature called The Genetic Tribunal, detailing real-life cases of unfit families and encouraging readers to report suspicious neighbors. Girls were taught early. Makeup was foreign corruption, pants were for men, and beauty came from racial health. In one 1936 article, a stylist warned, "Lipstick is for weak women. The new German woman shows her strength through clear eyes and unpainted skin." Every tool of culture was turned into a weapon: schools, radios, fashion, and even bedtime. Stories. Hitler's speeches rang over the radio like sermons. A man's world is the state. A woman's world is her home, her children, her husband. But this wasn't submission. It was rebranding. They didn't tell women they were weak. They told them they were sacred, that they were the seed-bearers of a 1,000-year empire, and millions believed it. The Nazi vision of womanhood wasn't just preached, it was paid for. Across Germany, the regime offered rewards for compliance. Young couples were granted marriage loans of 1,000 Reichsmarks, but only if the bride agreed to leave her job. With each child born, 25% of the debt was forgiven. 4 children meant the loan vanished. This was no ordinary welfare. It was a government-funded breeding program. In the industrial city of Dortmund, factory worker Martha Engel became a local icon after giving up her job to marry a railway clerk. In just 7 years, she bore 6 children. Her family was showered with state benefits, tax exemptions, preferred housing, and monthly food parcels, sausage, butter, sugar, luxuries few others could afford during those years. On Mother's Day, now a national holiday, Marta stood on a stage with a gold medal pinned to her dress. Photographers snapped her picture. Children handed her roses. The mayor called her a heroine of the homeland. What the photos didn't show were her hands, cracked from cold water and endless laundry, trembling as she held her 7th infant. Even employers were pulled into the plan. In Essen, the massive Krauss ammunition plant built a rest home for working mothers with 4 or more children. There, women could spend 2 weeks in peaceful retreat, while state caretakers looked after their families. Every policy had one goal: to make motherhood not just a duty, but a lifestyle, a status, a weapon. The woman who chose career was labeled selfish. The woman who birthed many was a patriot, but behind the rewards was surveillance. Behind the medals were expectations. A woman's value wasn't measured by her mind, her art, or her voice. It was measured in children. But the most disturbing chapter of Nazi motherhood was still to come, one written not in medals but in silence and shadows. In 1935, under orders from SS leader Konrad Heinrich, the regime launched a program called Lebenslicht, or Light of Life. It was billed as a charitable project to support single mothers. In truth, it was a breeding farm. The idea was chillingly simple. Select women of pure Aryan blood, pair them with SS officers, and breed the next generation of the master race. The first Lebenslicht home opened in the Alpine village of Weissenfeld, hidden behind the gates of a converted mansion. Inside, it looked serene: white linens, warm soup, lullabies. But the purpose was clinical. Women were catalogued like cattle, their family trees traced for generations. Doctors measured their skulls, their hips, their hair color. Ingrid Stahl, one of the first women to enter the program, later remembered, "We were pampered like queens and examined like livestock. My meals were perfect, but I couldn't leave. My womb had become property of the state." Fathers were rarely named. Some were married SS men, others were unknown. What mattered wasn't love, it was genetics. By 1940, there were 10 homes across Germany and more in occupied lands like Norway, where Nordic features made local women ideal candidates. Children born in Lebenslicht homes were baptized in Nazi ideology, given priority rations, and placed with loyal families, or raised within SS schools to become future officers. But not all the children were born. Some were taken. In Eastern Europe, thousands of blonde-haired, blue-eyed children were kidnapped, evaluated for racial purity, and absorbed into the program. Their real names were erased. Their languages were forbidden. They were Germanized, rebranded as part of the Reich's future. And the mothers? Many returned home, empty, their babies placed in state care. Others stayed, trapped in a cycle of sanctioned breeding, told they were pioneers of racial destiny. This was no longer motherhood, it was biological warfare. While the propaganda painted German women as nurturers and mothers, behind closed hospital doors, they became something else entirely. They became enforcers. In 1933, the Reich passed a law called the Act for the Protection of Hereditary Health. On paper, it sounded like medicine. In practice, it gave doctors and nurses the power to sterilize anyone deemed genetically unfit. Over the next decade, over 400,000 Germans, many with epilepsy, depression, disabilities, or simply nonconformist behavior, were sterilized by force, and standing at the operating tables were women. In the city of Leipzig, nurse Greta Waldhoff recorded every case in her leather-bound journal. Over 4 years, she assisted in 722 sterilizations. Her entry on October 9, 1937, was chillingly precise. Procedure successful. Patient removed quietly. One less threat to our bloodline. Across the country, midwives were turned into informants. The National Midwives Guild, run by Hedwig Krantz, required all 20,000 members to report infants with any sign of defect. A cleft palate, a limp, a slow reaction. It didn't take much. But the line from surveillance to death was short. In 1939, the regime escalated from sterilization to extermination. It began a program known as Action Serenity, the polite name for a horror that would become the model for the final solution. Hospitals were turned into killing centers. Gas chambers were built, and women, nurses, orderlies, matrons, carried it out with a cold, clinical calm. At Valberg Asylum, head nurse Herta Kunz administered lethal injections to disabled patients. She didn't flinch, she didn't hesitate. In her post-war testimony, she said, "We were told it was mercy, that death was a cure for weakness. She wasn't alone." Elise Morenz, a senior midwife, gave a graduation speech to her trainees in 1941. Her final words were remembered by one student. "Your hands will bring life into the world, but you must also know when to withhold it. Both are acts of devotion to our people." To the outside world, they were angels of care. Inside the wards, they were instruments of selection, and their white uniforms, once symbols of hope, became flags of terror. By 1939, the drums of war thundered across Europe. And once again, German women were given a new mission. This time, it wasn't just to give life, it was to hold the home front together. The propaganda shifted. Gone were the sunlit fields and bouncing babies. Now, posters showed stern housewives, patching old clothes, carrying firewood, stirring thin cabbage soup over modest stoves. The new battlefield was the kitchen, the sewing room, the ration line. Marta Voss, wife of a railway worker in Hamburg, became the face of this wartime resilience. Her story was published in the nation's Hearth magazine. With 5 children and a husband at the front, she learned to make soap from animal fat, to stretch one potato into a meal for 6, and to mend the same coat 3 times. Her face looked tired, but her eyes burned with duty. She wrote in a letter, "We do not fire bullets. We fire bread into hungry mouths. That is our victory." Women attended mandatory courses in victory cooking, efficient darning, and first aid for bombed homes. Cookbooks like Feeding the Reich by Ilse Harnitz became state-issued gifts for every new bride. Recipes inside taught how to turn turnips into pudding and how to use crushed eggshells as calcium supplements. Radio broadcasts instructed women to smile for their sons and never complain in the presence of children. Even bedtime stories were rewritten. In one tale, a little girl gives up her doll so her soldier brother can have boots. The most praised woman of all was Clara Gerstein, wife of Minister for Information. She bore 6 children, appeared in state newsreels knitting by candlelight, and declared, "The German woman now fights with spirit, not steel. With silence, not complaint. With patience, not rest." The Reich expanded its mother's army through the National Domestic Service, training tens of thousands of women to teach others how to endure scarcity without breaking. In rural towns and bombed cities, these home front instructors became commanders in aprons. To be a wife now meant to be a soldier in her own right, fighting hunger, fear, and loneliness with no weapons but love and loyalty. But this shift was not a release from ideology. It was a reinforcement of it. Women were not told they were equal. They were told they were essential, as long as they never left their place as, Allied soldiers stormed the gates of the Kaltenhof concentration camp in April 1945. They expected monsters. They found women, not victims, not prisoners, but guards, clad in crisp gray-blue uniforms, some still holding riding crops, some still smiling. Among them was Irma Drexler, a blonde, blue-eyed woman no older than 22. A British soldier later recalled, "She looked like an angel from a painting, but the things she did belonged in hell." This jarring contradiction would haunt liberators and historians for generations. How could women, the very symbols of care and nurture, become instruments of such deliberate cruelty? It began in 1939, when the SS opened Rosenfeld, the first major women's concentration camp. Female guards were needed, But Nazi ideology had preached domesticity for years, so recruitment wasn't easy. Early candidates came from prisons and hospitals. Women already comfortable with power, control, or routine discipline. As the war escalated, more were drafted. Some volunteered for steady pay. Others were conscripted. Few understood what awaited them. Training took place at Rosenfeld Academy, a grim compound where instructors taught far more than patrol routines. Chief Overseer Doretta Krantz, a veteran of the regime's sterilization program, led the indoctrination. She taught with whips, not words. Recruits practiced in model camps, wooden mock-ups where real prisoners were brought in for training scenarios. They learned to use rubber truncheons, to give commands without emotion, to ignore screams. Anna Brenner, one of the trainees, would later testify. The first time I saw a woman collapse under a beating, I ran away and vomited. By week 3, I didn't flinch. By graduation, I was leading the drills. At the final ceremony, each new Ordnungswärterin, female guard, was handed a uniform, a badge, and a polished leather whip. They were told, "For them, you are Germany." Once inside the camps, the transformation was complete. These women, once clerks, nannies, students, became predators in pressed skirts and leather boots. They didn't just follow orders. Many outdid the men. At Sturmbach camp, a frigid death. Camp tucked into Poland's woods, Guard Captain Liesel Ranke became infamous for her ice punishments. Prisoners were forced into barrels of freezing water in the dead of winter. If they cried out, they were beaten. If they collapsed, they were left to freeze. Dr. Olga Levin, a survivor and former physician, later wrote, "It was the women who studied our suffering. They learned our weaknesses like a game. They hurt us precisely where it broke us most." Some guards displayed rare acts of kindness, an extra piece of bread, a bandage. But even they selected who would receive such mercy. In the camps, compassion became another form of control. The most feared of all was Irma Drexler, known to prisoners as the Beautiful Phantom. Tall, elegant, barely out of girlhood, she had custom-made boots with steel reinforcements. She used them to kick, to kill, to maim. She kept attack dogs and unleashed them with a single whistle. She carried a list of names each day, women chosen not for what they had done, but for how they looked. Smooth skin, no blemishes. These women weren't just sent to the gas. Their bodies were used for experiments, and, it's whispered, for the camp commandant's grotesque collection. At her trial in 1945, Irma stood silently in court. Her hair was combed, her uniform pressed. She was 22 years old. She was hanged without a word. But she was not the only one. Ilse Koch, wife of the commandant at Brennhold, rode horseback through the camp, whip in hand, dressed in furs while prisoners starved. Her greatest pride wasn't her zoo or her riding arena. It was her collection, lampshades, gloves, and books, made from tattooed human skin. And she smiled as she showed them off. What made these women so dangerous wasn't that they were monsters from birth. It was that they weren't. They were ordinary. Maria Felser was once a hotel receptionist in a quiet Bavarian town. Ilona Weiss had been a farm girl. Nadine Maurer played piano at her village church. None of them showed signs of cruelty. Until they put on a uniform. In the camps, they didn't just follow orders. They discovered new ways to break people. At Gravenwald, Maria Felser created an orchestra of imprisoned women. Talented violinists, pianists, and cellists were forced to play as others marched to their deaths. Sometimes she requested specific songs, waltzes, lullabies, opera overtures, music to cover the sound of murder. She kept a notebook, her memory book, with names, dates, and photos of her favorite prisoners. She signed each death, order in perfect cursive. Nadine Maurer, who trained attack dogs at Holzenbruck, treated executions like entertainment. "Go fetch," she would whisper to her German shepherd as if sending it after a ball. Not a human being. When her dog killed, she clapped. And then there was Ursula Krantz, called the Red Widow by survivors. She invented games. One involved forcing children to run laps to a fence and back. The last child to return was taken. No one ever saw them again. Women like these weren't punished often. Most never faced trial. Fewer than 50 female guards were ever convicted, out of more than 3,500 who served across the camps. When the Allies came, many slipped back into the fabric of civilian life. Housewives, dressmakers, mothers. Helga Metz, a known guard from Münzburg, lived quietly in Detroit for decades. Her neighbor once said, "She was kind, baked cookies for the kids. I never imagined she could hurt a soul, but she had." Many. When the war ended, the world demanded justice, but justice came slowly, and only for a few. In 1945, at the Kaltenhof trials in Lunenburg, 11 women stood among the accused. They wore prison clothes, not SS uniforms. Among them was Irma Drexler, the beautiful executioner of Sturmbach. Survivors testified for hours. Doctors described the beatings. Children spoke of dogs, whips, and starvation. But even in chains, Drexler stood with her head high. When sentenced to death, her only request was to be hanged in full SS uniform. The British denied it. Ilse Koch, the sadistic wife of the camp commandant, claimed innocence. She said the skin lamps were lies, that she was merely renovating her home, that she loved animals, not violence. She was sentenced to life. But in 1948, her punishment was reduced to just 4 years by an American general named William Crane, who called her a tragic woman, not a monster. The world exploded in outrage. Congressional hearings were launched. Survivors wept in disbelief. But the decision stood. In the decades that followed, many more simply vanished. Some, like Brunhilde Stein, emigrated under new identities. She lived in New York for 20 years before a survivor spotted her in a grocery store. Her husband, an American veteran, refused to believe it. She couldn't hurt a fly, he said. She had been called the stomping mare for the way she trampled prisoners with iron-studded boots. Others lived quiet lives in Europe, working as seamstresses, midwives, or nannies. Most never faced charges. Some married Allied soldiers, blending in as war brides. They became invisible. Even when found, prosecutors struggled. How do you convict a grandmother for crimes committed in a uniform she hadn't worn in 40 years? Simon Weissman, the Nazi hunter who tracked down over 200 war criminals, once wrote, "We were searching for demons. But the world only saw housewives. And that's how many escaped, not by hiding, but by looking normal. While some women wielded whips in the camps, others fought a quieter war, armed not with bullets, but secrets." In the fall of 1944, a striking blonde woman checked into a Paris hotel under the name Dr. Elise Winter. Her French was flawless, her passport perfect. She claimed to be a fashion buyer. She was in fact a Nazi intelligence agent, transmitting Allied troop movements to Berlin using a radio hidden in her cosmetics case. When resistance fighters finally captured her, they were stunned. One of them later said, "She looked like someone you'd see in a cafe, not a battlefield." But Elise Winter was only one of hundreds. Behind the Reich's image of the ideal German mother, a secret network of female spies, informants, and couriers was thriving, trained, recruited, and deployed by the Abwehr and SD, Nazi Germany's military and political intelligence agencies. They called them salon dames, women who moved through embassies, hotels, and high society circles with ease. Most were fluent in multiple languages, schooled in seduction, and trained in poisons and Morse code. At a secluded Bavarian estate known only as Haus Edelweiss, dozens of women were trained in espionage techniques. One recruit, Margot Schaefer, recalled learning how to kill with a hat pin and how to extract state secrets with a smile. Their greatest strength? Being underestimated. Vera von Rosen, a Danish-German socialite, operated in London before the war. Posing as an anti-communist refugee, she charmed naval officers at dinners and private clubs. Through pillow talk, she gathered blueprints, ship schedules, and passwords. Her handler once boasted, "She got more intelligence than 12 men combined." And then there was the brothel. In Berlin's Charlottenburg district, Salon Elysia operated as a high-class house of pleasure. But behind its velvet curtains was a network of wiretaps, hidden microphones, and women trained by the SS. Diplomats, generals, Even Nazi officials suspected of disloyalty were recorded, exposed, and destroyed. One operative, Sophie Wagner, seduced half the Swedish diplomatic corps. She extracted trade secrets during post-dinner chats and casual bed conversations, then passed them to Berlin in lipstick tubes and hollowed-out heels. But not all espionage required seduction. Older, plainer women served as couriers, crossing borders with microfilm sewn into their dresses or hidden in buttons, hairpins, and toothpaste caps. One woman, Ilse Mertens, made 27 crossings between Switzerland and Germany. She looked like a schoolteacher. No one ever searched her. And still, it went deeper. Inside Germany, thousands of civilian women became informants, embedded in apartment buildings, schools, churches. They eavesdropped on neighbors, reported their husbands, betrayed their own families. One such woman, Irma Seltzer, turned in her husband for mocking Hitler in private. He was sentenced to 5 years in Dachau. When questioned after the war, she said, "I loved him, but I loved the Führer more." These women weren't anomalies. They were the eyes and ears of a regime that trusted silence more than loyalty. The Third Reich crumbled. Its women didn't vanish. They disappeared into new names, new borders, and new lies. Many burned their uniforms. Some altered their papers. Others simply blended into crowds of refugees, convoys of war widows, waves of displaced civilians. The world was eager to move on. In Amsterdam, a Jewish woman named Leah Voss, desperate to save her family, made a terrible deal with the Gestapo. She betrayed over 200 Jews, including relatives. When the war ended, she was one of the few women executed by Dutch authorities for collaboration. In Warsaw, a bakery worker named Helena Sawicka reported customers who bought too much bread. She suspected they were hiding Jews. She was paid for every arrest. In Budapest, a group called the Charity Ladies posed as aid workers, only to expose the addresses of Jewish safe houses to fascist militias. Their victims weren't strangers. Many were neighbors, friends, even distant family. Some women betrayed to save themselves, others did it for money. But some did it because they believed. And when the Reich fell, not all were punished. Margot Ulrich, a trained SD agent who once carried cyanide capsules in her coat lining, reappeared in Switzerland as a widowed innkeeper. Her guest house became a quiet meeting spot for Western intelligence during the early Cold War. Her file, once marked with a red swastika, was scrubbed clean. In Bavaria, former courier Erika Seidel was discovered working as a translator for American forces. Instead of arrest, she was recruited for Operation Greystone, an anti-Soviet program. Her past was buried under strategic value. One CIA memo from 1947 read, "Female assets from German services provide exceptional utility. Their activities remain largely undocumented. Their deniability is an advantage." And so many walked free. Some married Allied soldiers. Some raised families. Some wrote memoirs filled with half-truths and silences. But their legacy lives on, in the whispers of survivors, in the names carved into memorial walls, and in the chilling realization that atrocity wears many faces. It smiles, it nurtures, it sings lullabies, and sometimes it walks away without ever looking back.